HighBridge, a division of recorded books, presents The Curse of the Giant Hogweed by Charlotte Macleod. Read by John Mclain.
Chapter 1. For God's sake, Pete, is that old coot still blethering? Professor Timothy Ames was sorry he'd bothered to wake up. He was also sorry he'd fallen asleep. These green fiberglass chairs were hell on an old man's skinny backside. What the Christ were they here for, anyway? He hated being lectured at. He wasn't used to assembly rooms carved willy-nilly out of erstwhile stately homes. He wished he were back at Balaclava Agricultural College in the hinterlands of Massachusetts, USA, checking the boron in the beet fields. His companion, the if possible even more distinguished Professor Peter Shandy, wished Tim would quit turning off his hearing aid. When it wasn't operating, Tim never knew whether he was mouthing words without letting any sound come out, or bellowing like a bull in rut. This time, Tim had bellowed. Peter could only be thankful they were at a British university, where it seemed not the done thing to notice eccentric behavior in elderly academics. Perhaps the speaker had his own hearing aid turned off. Despite Tim's outcry and a few muttered hears that had followed it, Peter couldn't see that Professor Filtride was showing any sign of shutting up. So far, Filtride had said nothing about the giant hogweed, or Heracleum matagozaneum, that the overseas visitors didn't already know. Naturally, Tim and Peter had done their research before they'd agreed to come here and lend their expertise toward eradicating the oversized pest. They'd heard how this gargantuan relative of the cow parsley and the water hemlock was taking over the riverbanks and hedgerows. Smaller plants that couldn't grow in its noxious shade were threatened with extinction. Birdwatchers were being carted off to the hospitals with severe cases of whiplash from craning their necks to hurl anathemas up its 15-foot stalks. Courting couples were getting contact dermatitis in embarrassing places from brushing against its venomous bristles. Nudist camps were all but wiped out. Fishermen were succumbing to apoplexy in droves. The accursed weed grew so thick around the streams that they couldn't indulge in their piscatorial pursuits without importing machetes or sharpening up their ancestral broadaxes to hack their way to the water. And the dingy white flower heads were alleged to produce 5,000 seeds apiece. Peter Shandy intended to count a few headfuls of seeds. He was curious to know whether 5,000 was a true figure, or merely one plucked from the air by some sensation-mongering journalist. The chances were it was fairly close to the mark, though. Mother Nature was apt to err on the side of prodigality. When it came to wordiness, Professor Filtride was also a child of nature. That was plain. He was talking about the excellent work already done by hogweed experts on this side of the water. They'd thought for a time they had the hogweed hogtied, but all of a sudden, the weeds had begun to spring new-bristled, taller, ranker, smellier, and more pestiferous than ever before. They'd spread almost overnight to places where no hogweed had previously infiltrated. This meeting was being held in one such place, among the lush green hills where England blends so delightfully into Wales, and the sheep all begin bleating in Cymric as soon as you cross the border. Peter thought he could hear sheep bleating now. Or was that still the old goat maundering on about the hogweed? Tim was asleep again. Peter was feeling his jet lag. When this ordeal by windbag was over, would his hosts offer him and his companions yet more cups of milky tea, or free them to go somewhere and sink their nozzles into pints of the magnificent local bitter? Peter thought wistfully of the pub in which his wife Helen and her dear friend Iduna Stott were no doubt resting their weary feet and wetting their dainty whistles after an arduous round of the sights and the shops. It had been understood that he, Tim, and Dan Stott, the third member of their team, wouldn't be able to spend much time with the women. Their hosts were paying Tim's and Peter's expenses, hoping for great results from the developers of such horticultural wonders as Brassica napobrassica balaclavanensis and Portulaca purple passion. Since he was here on business, he ought to be keeping his mind on the discourse. But it kept drifting off into reveries about the respective excellences of Helen and British beer. Then Peter sat up with a jolt. The speaker had actually and finally stopped speaking. There was a spattering of applause, in which he only just managed to join. The learned lady conducting the seminar, whose name Peter couldn't for the life of him recall, was now suggesting their distinguished guest Professor Ames, or perhaps Professor Stott, or even Professor Shandy, would care to address some of the points Professor Filtride had just raised. Tim didn't stir. Dan Stott, on Peter's other side, was sitting wrapped in reverie, perhaps computing the number of hogs that might be needed to eat up all those acres of hogweed, and wondering what would be the effects on their digestive systems if they tried. Obviously, it was up to Shandy. Peter couldn't remember any questions other than Tim's, which had been brought up by Professor Filtride's discourse, so he decided to go with that one. He detached himself from his abominable chair, sauntered up to the front of the room, wearing the expression of mixed humility and conscious self-satisfaction deemed appropriate for such occasions, took hold of the sides of the lectern, smiled, not broadly but enough to show he wasn't actually hostile, and said his piece. "I expect you'll all agree that my learned colleague, if I may presume to call him so, has given us sufficient food for thought at this juncture. Rather than take up your time with speculations on what might or might not be feasible courses of action, I'm simply going to ask that you point Professor Ames, Professor Stott, and myself in the general direction of a reliable car hire agency, a decent pub, and a clump of giant hogweed. Once we've done a little field work, I trust it won't be long before we come up with some recommendations." "On what do you base this confident expectation of a speedy result?" demanded the inevitable cynic in the back row. Timothy Ames was awake now. He heard that one perfectly, and was ready with the answer. "On the fact that Professor Shandy's wife has spent half the winter writing a paper on Belial Buggins, the Bard of Balaclava. She's been asked to present it at a conference in Arizona next month, and there'll be hell to pay if we don't finish here in time and get her back for the presentation. Any further questions?" There were none. Several of the listening savants smiled. One or two laughed aloud, and a learned academic discussion broke out as to which pub had the best bidder. The meeting was adjourned to the Pig and Clover. Peter had a pint and a ploughman's lunch. Tim had a half and a small wedge of poacher's pie. Dan had the rest of the pie, a few pasties, and 2 pints. On their way to the car hire, he purchased 5 punnets of gooseberries and a whole cheddar cheese to tide them over until they could get to a proper restaurant. Peter had intended to rent a big car, big at least by United Kingdom standards, but there were only Fiats available. That was all right. They'd manage. Aside from their field equipment, he and the boys had little luggage. Peter himself carried his grandfather Shandy's old black cowhide satchel with a change of underwear, his razor, and field clothes to replace the good gray suit and white shirt he'd worn to the lecture. Tim had a clean pair of socks and a spare battery for his hearing aid crammed into a pocket of his hairy old brown tweed jacket. Dan had his cheese, his gooseberries, and a pigskin suitcase packed with God knew what. Sandwiches, probably, by the loving hands of Iduna. Dan got in back with the impedimenta, Tim climbed in front on the passenger side, and Peter got to drive. He'd expected that. In fact, he'd have insisted on driving. Peter was not only the youngest of the three, he was also the most likely to stay awake, to recall where they were going, to keep on the left-hand side of the road, and to know a giant hogweed when he saw one. Once they'd found a suitable place to start, he and Tim would begin collecting plant specimens and soil samples. Dan Stott's function, as head of Balaclava's animal husbandry department and a noted authority on swine culture, was more nebulous. Peter suspected Dan had invited himself and Iduna along, mainly because he found something appealing in the mere concept of a giant hogweed, and might secretly be on the side of the enemy. Dan would bear watching. That shouldn't be hard, of course, Stott's dimensions being what they were. Whatever might be in store for them, the three old friends were merry enough as they set off on their quest for the giant hogweed. Nor were they long in finding some. It would have been difficult not to. The hedgerows so sensibly allowed over here to grow up and provide natural fences, refuges for small wildlife, and anti-erosion barriers for the soil, instead of being mowed flat in the alleged interest of modern efficiency, were being taken over by the biggest and ugliest representative of the umbelliferae. The band of hogweed hunters didn't stop to examine any of the available specimens, though, until they'd put a safe distance between themselves and the halls of academe. The woods, as Tim observed darkly, might be full of goddamn professors wanting to make speeches. They couldn't be too careful. Hence, it was not until the Fiat had carried them well into Wales that Dan Stott, who had steeled himself not to emit grunts of anguish at each pub they passed, suggested they might now think of stopping for refreshment. Peter didn't mind. The field behind the pub toward which Dan pointed was rife with some of the tallest and thickest hogweed they'd spotted thus far. Tim was all for stopping too. "At least they'll have a gents," he observed. "One thing about the British, and the Welsh I suppose I'd better say before they run me out of the country. They've got a civilized attitude toward the natural functions." The pub even had a parking lot, about 10 feet square, and surrounded by a high stone wall. Peter couldn't get the Fiat in, though, until a brewer's lorry had accomplished the patently impossible feat of making a full turn, then squeezing through a gateway some 4 inches narrower than the lorry. This being the land of Merlin, it took the driver 3 minutes. After that, they had the lot to themselves. Peter pulled up next to a rear door that led directly to the necessary offices. Dan, who'd finished the gooseberries, but brought his cheese along for company, went with Tim into the men's room. Peter went on ahead to the bar. As so often happens in country pubs, he found the room empty. That was all right. Peter didn't mind standing there admiring the mellow patina on the polished brass pump handles, weighing the relative merits of ale and lager. This place had an odd sort of atmosphere about it, he thought, and tried to figure out why. Perhaps it was simply that nobody was here, neither behind the bar, nor hunched on one of the benches behind a pint glass as tall as his head. Perhaps it was because the pub was old. Really old, not tarted up old. To be sure, in this area, anything not built by Edward II might be considered relatively modern. This had been a public house well before Edward's time, though. Maybe long before. Peter Shandy couldn't have said how he knew. The pub was clean enough, and reasonably well kept up. It must have been renovated many times. Nevertheless, it smelled old. No, more than old. Primeval. Like a forest floor that had never been cleared and put to the plow. In centuries gone, they'd brewed their own beer here, no doubt. It would have been thick and heavy, served in leather jacks that never got washed between one customer and the next. The customers wouldn't have been washed either. They'd have had on crude homespun or leather garments, stiffened with sweat to the shapes of their bodies. The pub wouldn't have smelled old then. It would have stunk like a pigsty. Not one of Dan Stott's pigsties, of course. Dan held to the tenet that a clean pig was a happy pig. No doubt he knew whereof he mucked. At least Dan's pigs always appeared happy enough. What the hell was keeping Dan anyway? Where was Tim? Where was the publican? Where was anybody? Great balls of fire, where was Peter Shandy? Gradually, without his knowing when or how, Peter's feet had moved from ancient oak planking to forest floor. This had never, not possibly, been anything other than forest floor. The trees around him had roots as big around as beer kegs, knotted into the earth like giant hawsers, as they needs must be to hold upright the incredible trunks growing from them. There was a simple explanation for this phenomenon, Peter thought. He was drunk. No, that wouldn't work. He still hadn't laid eyes on the bartender, let alone got his pint. He'd fallen asleep. That was it. He'd succumbed to jet lag and the backlash from Professor Filtride's learned discourse. Or maybe he'd hypnotized himself, staring at those shiny pump handles. No matter. Tim and Dan would come along and rouse him as soon as they'd finished whatever was taking them so long back there. In the meantime, he might as well relax and enjoy his nap. It felt strange to know he was asleep, yet not feel the least bit sleepy. But then one usually didn't in a dream. One didn't always have such powerful tactile sensations either. Peter slapped at a gnat that was lunching on his cheekbone, and made blasphemous utterance as he banged his toe on one of those mammoth tree roots. It was odd that his toe hurt from the banging, come to think of it. He'd put on his heavy work boots when they'd got into the Fiat. Peter looked down at his feet and saw he was wearing primitive buskins, made of roughly shaped leather, drawn up over his feet like the dough around an apple in a dumpling. Thongs were laced across the tops and around his ankles to keep them on. Well, such things happened in dreams. He ought to be grateful he was having this relatively innocuous excursion around the fringes of the subconscious, instead of the recurring nightmare in which he'd find himself lecturing to a crowded classroom, stark naked, except for a giant hogweed stuck Hawaiian-style behind his right ear. Or was it the left ear? One side meant, "Come to me, beloved." The other meant, "Sorry, my wife won't let me." But he couldn't remember which was which. That came from his having been driving on the wrong side of the road all afternoon, he supposed. It wouldn't have mattered in this particular dream anyway. He'd been more concerned about such niceties back in the pre-Helen period, when he'd got more deeply involved with the biologist from Amherst than he'd meant to. Christabel, her name was. How in Sam Hill had Christabel snuck into his dream anyhow? Drat it, the Randy Shandy of lore was a respectably married man now. Peter wished Helen would manifest herself instead. He liked dreaming about Helen. He couldn't think of much about Helen that he didn't like, except that he was here and she was... where? In some quaint old-world tea-shop by now, scoffing up scones with Iduna, while he was being led up the forest path by an overexcited id. Why the flaming perdition didn't Tim and Dan come along and wake him up? Maybe they decided he needed his rest, and left him to slumber among the beer pumps while they quaffed their restoratives. No, they wouldn't have allowed him to remain draped over the bar for some wondering professor to see and to deride. They'd have dragged him over and laid him down, on one of those oaken benches so picturesquely hollowed by so many generations of bucolic buttocks. His wisest course might therefore be to select a likely root and lie down upon it, perhaps conjuring up a few robins to cover him with leaves for added comfort. Then he could dream himself to sleep so that he could wake up on all levels of consciousness at once and get the show back on the road. Why couldn't he have simply dreamed himself out into that fine stand of hogweed? He could have gotten a spot of preliminary investigation and saved himself some time. Peter could see no hogweed around here, wherever here might be. Too shady, no doubt. It was going to be a howling shame to cut down such noble trees as these. They'd have to go sometime, though, so the land could be cleared for farming. He hoped he'd wake up before that happened. Peter was getting concerned about his companions. Dan Stott, to be sure, had Festina Lente engraven on his backbone, but Tim was brisk enough. Unless his mind wandered to trace elements. Cripes, if Dan had gone to ruminating and Tim to pondering the subtler nuances of boron in the beet fields again, he could be stuck in this imaginary forest till the cows came home. Assuming there were any cows to come. So far, Peter had seen no sign of life, except that one gnat, which he'd swatted out of whatever existence it might have been supposed to possess. He was getting lonesome. Maybe that dream about a room full of snickering students would have been preferable after all. Why didn't something happen? Chapter 2. His grandmother had always said it wasn't safe to wish for anything, because if you did, you might get it. Shandy was kicking petulantly at a root, bemoaning like Arthur Guiterman's Camuel, his too distinguished onlyness, when he got poked in the chest by a harp. "What the hell?" was his natural reaction. "Oh, sorry." Above the twanging of agitated harp strings, the apology came loud and clear. "Force of habit." The speaker was, as perhaps Peter might have expected, a giant. A mere stripling among giants, to be sure, probably not more than 7 feet in height, and a paltry yard or so across the shoulders. Still, this was an impressive enough giant to dream up on one's first try. Peter Shandy would not have wanted a larger giant. He wasn't at all sure he wanted this one. However, the giant's not uncomely countenance looked amiable enough, not to say contrite. "'Tis this goddamn enchantment I be under," he was explaining. "I haven't got used to traveling without my lance. I mean, ye meet a wizard, it's ye customary etiquette of ye jest to ram ye old lance-tip up against his tabard and make him confess what he hath been up to. Ye blasted wizards be always up to something." He straightened the wreath of giant hogweed that had slid cockeyed on his flowing golden locks, hitched up the skirt of his white robe to scratch a thigh the size of an oak bowl, and sighed. "I forgot what ye protocol be for a bard in a situation like this. Ye wouldn't happen to recall I misdoubt me?" "Sorry," Shandy answered. "I'm a stranger here, myself. Do I gather you are in fact a knight-errant who's been turned by some form of necromancy into a traveling poet?" "Ugh," said the giant. "I hight Torchel Yedur. Hide it, I mean, until this morning I wot not what I hight now. Torchel your Anabethial, perhaps." "Too bad," Shandy replied, knowing somehow that the former meant the intrepid, and the latter meant the hopeless. "Not about the Torcheld part, I mean. Torcheld's a first-rate name. I know somebody with a name very much like it. As a matter of fact, you remind me—" "Ugh," the giant interrupted. Never mind that. Ye be supposed to tell me how ye hight. I remember that much anyway. So I am. Well, I hight Peter Shandy. Actually, I'm not a wizard. I'm a professor. A what? A teacher. Oh, a druid. Why saidst ye not so in ye first place? Dost ken any poetry? Quite a lot, as a matter of fact. Have you heard the one about the young lady of Niger who smiled as she rode on a tiger? Torchard clearly had not. Nor, as Shandy realized a few syllables too late, would he be likely to know the meaning of either Niger or tiger. The sample had been ill chosen. But why did the giant have to cry about it? For crying, Torchard incredibly was. Dash it all, snapped Shandy. I didn't mean to hurt your feelings. Here, take my handkerchief and blow your nose like a good chap. It was then that he became aware he no longer possessed a handkerchief, nor a pocket to carry one in. Like the enchanted warrior blubbering before him, he was wearing a longish robe of what might in a romance be described as fairest white linen. To Peter it looked coarsely woven, badly wrinkled, and none too clean. As for the handkerchief, Torchard wouldn't have known that word either, and didn't appear to be interested. He merely sniffed a mighty sniffle, and ignored the tears on his cheeks, this being evidently some kind of golden age, when a man didn't have to go around acting manly if he didn't happen to feel like it. I weep for ye, Lady Sieglinde, he explained with simple dignity. Ye being a druid, and therefore possessed of unbounded wisdom, I perceive a kindly spirit hath set me in thy way, that I may unto thee my woeful tale unfold. Prithee, haul up a root and ease thy feet. This may take a while. I'm in no hurry, said Peter, draping his laundry more snugly about him, and settling into the shade of a giant oak. Tim and Dan must be just about getting to work on their second pints by now, so he might as well nap a while longer. This dream was beginning to liven up. Okay, shoot. That is, unfold thy tale. What happened to Lady Sieglinde? Did she get enchanted too? My Sieglinde be herself an enchantment, Torchard groaned. Forsooth, had it not been for that old hag Dwild, we should e'en now be wending our way to the battlements, thereon to plight our troth. Sieglinde and I spend quite a lot of time plighting our troth, he admitted, with what might, in a less awesome figure, have been described as a boyish grin. At least we did, until Fifner disappeared. Did you say Fifner? In sooth, Torchard replied in some surprise. So did ye also. Why not? That be his height. Yes, but who is he? Meseemed ye druids be supposed to want this stuff. He be my great-uncle Sven's pet griffin. Drat it, you can't expect me to remember the name of every griffin that comes flapping along, said Peter testily. We druids have far weightier matters to occupy our minds. What's so special about Fifner? He be not a bad old scout as griffins go. Great-uncle Sven hath him trained to roll over and play enchanted, sit up and beg for boiled eels, give ye his talon, all kinds of cute tricks. And when ye throne room groweth too cold, Fife can always breathe fire and warm ye place up. Yes, I see. A comforting sort of beast to have around, no doubt. You spoke of a throne room. Your great-uncle would then be King Sven? Aye, so he be. And I be his great-nephew, and Sieglinde his ward. She and I had it all fixed up. We were going to get wedlocked, and build ourselves a cozy little castle, with our own portcullis, and settle down to raising eels in ye moat, and dig riffwich in ye royal chamber. Shandy didn't have much trouble figuring out dig riffwich either. Your own castle, eh? Then you're not in line to inherit your great-uncle's kingdom. Nay, Druid, I be only...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?